Hello and welcome to Food to Go, the podcast brought to you by the New Food Team and brought to you in association with Merck Life Sciences. My name is Joshua Minchin, I'm the editor of New Food, and sat across from me, as ever, is New Food assistant editor, Grace Geller. Grace, you look freezing, you've got your coat on inside.
I am quite chilly. It's just turned March and I don't think I've worn my coat in the office for a while, but the weather seems to be getting colder as we approach spring, which
It is cold, yeah.
concerning.
Spring, no spring in sight at all at the moment. I'm really excited about today's episode, second part of our AI mini-series, I suppose. So a couple of weeks ago we heard from Jorge Hernandez from Wendy's, who gave us a really nice introduction, I suppose, on how a huge food retailer is using AI to make decisions about food safety and potentially enhance food safety. Today is, I suppose, a bit more of a nuts and bolts conversation. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I completely agree, Josh. I think working out how AI is evolving and what is going on behind the scenes and working out how companies across the world can and are thinking about utilising it and making it effective in their own business. So we spoke to someone who's really behind the scenes with AI and knows the nitty-gritty far better than we do.
Yes, Grace, absolutely right. So we spoke to Bas van der Velden from Wageningen University. Not the easiest university to say.
I'm very impressed with your pronunciation
Yeah, I thought I did quite well there, I must say. If you are Dutch or speak Dutch and listening, please do write in with the correct pronunciation. Bas is part of the data science team at Wageningen, and he is a font of knowledge when it comes to AI and big data, and has been working on some really exciting projects. So we were very, very grateful that he could give us some of his time and explain a bit more about the real cutting edge of this topic, which is, I think, where it's most interesting. So let's see what Bas had to say. Well, Bas, thank you so much for joining me on Food to Go and for postponing for a week because I had an awful illness last week, which meant I couldn't record. So thank you very much for being so flexible.
Thanks for having me, Josh.
No, not at all. Just before we, I suppose, get into the meat of our conversation today, could you explain just a little bit about, first of all, who you are and what you do at Wageningen, which relates to our conversation today around AI and food safety?
Yes, sure. Yeah, I can. So my name is Bas van der Velde. I'm Dutch. I live in the Netherlands. Wageningen is also located in the Netherlands, and we are a university and research center that is focused mainly on food and agro stuff. In that regard, I work at Wageningen Food Safety Research, and what we do here is we make sure that there's safe food for everyone. So that's a lot of there's a lot of checking food. So basically looking in the lab whether food is contaminated, for example, or not. And we also do a lot of research. What I do here is I'm the head of the data science team, and we do a lot of research on AI to investigate new trends of AI in food safety, and we also help with our tasks that we do, our regular operational tasks, so to say.
Bas, first question for you. We've mentioned the word AI already in our conversation, but I know that a lot of what you work with is what we call big data. What do we mean by big data? Isn't all data big?
Not necessarily. You can also have data sets of, 10, 20, 100 data points. I would not call that big. We have a lot of big data, both internal and external. So internal, we measure every day, all year round, samples for example, contaminations like microbiological contaminations, but also pesticide, PFAS, those kind of things. If you collect enough of that, then you get big data. But we also look online. We investigate what's out there on the internet, and if you collect all of that to research potential food hazards, then that's also considered big data.
And I suppose my second question, which is a very, very big one, and it's a mean one to start an interview with, but how do we use big data to keep food safe? In a nutshell, why does this matter to the food and beverage industry?
I think those are two different questions. So let me start with your latter question. Why does this matter? I think that by not analyzing all this data, you get to anecdotal evidences, and we would like to work on an evidence-based approach. And to do that, you really need to analyze the patterns in the data. And data is becoming more complex and more abundant. So it sums up. Back in the day, it used to be just one measurement per sample, for example. Now we have, in some cases, entire metagenomic profiles which we need to analyze. So the data becomes more and more complex, and therefore the methodology that we need to adopt to better process this data and to get clear patterns and also warnings, for example, out of it, also become more and more complex.
And where does the AI come in then? Because as you say, we're using very, very complex data. The title of our episode is Applications of AI. So once we've collected that data, how are we using artificial intelligence to put it into practice?
Yeah, there are numerous ways. We have multiple approaches that we use. For example, let's say a sample comes in and it gets mashed up and we look at it under the microscope. A human then looks at whether there's something in there that shouldn't be in there, but we can of course also use computer vision techniques for that. Those are similar to what the big tech companies have been using a while, but we in research have been using those techniques also for decades now. And recently they've switched to deep learning. And with deep learning, it helps if you have more data, so that big data comes into play again, to, for example, classify with the computer whether there's something going on in that sample. One of the things that we can do then is flag this sample and let the technician look at it in more detail. Another example, if I may, this is an example that's, so an image is relatively easy, right? We can see it with our eyes, but we also analyze a lot with mass spectrometry, which gives very complex multidimensional signals. And that is really a pain to assess as a human, and it really takes a lot of time. And we're also trying to automate that with deep learning.
Gosh, that seems like quite revolutionary technology for the food and beverage sector. But what's the main application of it? I suppose what I'm asking, is it speed? Is it volume of samples that can be analysed? Could we potentially even predict food safety issues before they arise?
Yes, yes to all three, I would say. So typically it's either automating things, so analyzing something faster or on the background so that you don't need a lot of manual labor in there, or you can look for complementary things. Assessing a food safety hazard before it arises could be one of those. So what you can imagine is that a lot of times we look at independent samples, and we of course know what we saw before in the past, but it's very difficult for a human to distill these patterns on the long run. And if we have something that just utilizes all the data, then we can see, this is an anomaly. We haven't seen this before. Maybe investigate this a little bit further.
That seems like kind of science fiction stuff. It's incredible. So could we also be in a position where we analyze certain markers, certain patterns of product or of samples, and then, as you say, think, okay, we've seen what happens when we see these conditions in the past. It's time to do a full audit. It's time to do a deep clean. Is that the kind of direction this technology is moving in?
That is one of the options, indeed. You mentioned science fiction. That's very interesting. I understand why you would say that, although it is also something that is currently used in quite a couple of fields. For example, in the banking world, this is what happens. So if you use your credit card in a country where it's unexpected, then you might get a call from your bank asking you, "Hey, Josh, is this you, or is this something going on?" So it is actually being used. Also in medicine, that's also been used to automatically flag certain exams and screening, so that a radiologist has to look at it a bit further. So yeah, this is it sounds science fiction, but it is actual non-fiction, I would say.
That's such a great point. And you've hit the nail on the head, because when you mentioned the banking example, a light bulb went off in my brain, and I thought, well, of course, that technology exists. I've been on the end of that phone call.
Me too.
Why is it that when it comes to, like you say, banking and medicine, we are very accepting and we understand the technology and we're more than happy for it to be used. But when it comes to keeping our food safe, there is that level of disbelief, trepidation. Why do you think that is?
That's a good question. I would say I'm not sure if that's really the case, but food safety is of course a very conservative field in itself because because it affects so many people, and in healthcare you can also see those cautionary tales. So there you also have to jump through tons of hoops in order to get the system like that in place. Often between publishing the first initial system and having it running in the clinic typically takes 10 years. So I would say that food is indeed also somewhat conservative, but it's not necessarily an exception towards other fields.
Grace, one thing I am always in awe of is the innovation happening in our food and beverage industry.
Josh, I'm exactly the same. I'm constantly reporting on the most exciting stories, whether it's a crucial piece of food safety research or the latest developments in the world of cultured meat.
Yes, I mean, to me, cultured meat is one of the most fascinating corners of our sector, and all eyes are on it in terms of it becoming the next big thing in food. Could it be the solution to some of the greatest challenges we face?
Well, funny you should say that, Josh, because our podcast partner Merck is also watching on with a very keen eye and has a dedicated team ready to help assist the food and beverage industry with tailored support when it comes to customized cell culture media, QC and HACCP solutions, and regulatory guidance.
Yes, absolutely, Grace. And let's not forget the plant-based protein, precision fermentation, or regenerative agriculture side either. It's so important nowadays to have a multifaceted approach as an F&B manufacturer, and Merck really gets this. Like they say, we just have to change as a sector if we are to become more sustainable.
You can explore possibilities and learn more about Merck's contribution to this exciting field at www.sigmaaldrich.com/cultured meat.
Bash, and when you've spoken and worked with big players in the food and beverage industry, have you come across that trepidation, that unease about utilising non-human technology, I suppose, in keeping our food safe? Is there a worry that if we take humans out of the food safety process that more mistakes would happen?
I think we should not take humans out of the system. I understand your question. So what you can, something that can happen is that you would have a fully automated system that makes wrong decisions. Therefore, I think it's important to have the proper safeguards, but also to understand better what these machine learning or AI systems are doing. One of the things we're focusing on at WFSR is explainable AI, which really wants to probe an AI system to give proper explanations why it made a certain decision. So let's say that a can of soda gets called back because an AI system says that there's something wrong with it. One of the most important things here is to be able to explain why it came to that decision and also to validate whether that's a correct decision in the end.
That seems like a very crucial stage in the process. As humans, we love rationale, we love reasoning. How do we get better at communicating what the technology does, I suppose, to the people that are going to use it? Because as you mentioned earlier, it does sound like it's science fiction. How does your team and teams like yours get better at explaining the technology?
Yeah, this is an entire field in itself. It's called explainable AI or interpretable machine learning. And this is something that we've been researching for some years now. It's, if you would compare it to the lifespan of a human, it's still in its baby or toddler phase, but it is advancing quite a bit. There's a lot of international research about this, how to explain algorithm decisions to the end user. And I think we should also incorporate what our domain users want from it. So, for example, if you would have to explain something to a medical doctor, you probably need a different explanation to compared to when you need to explain something to a banker. Same holds for food safety experts.
Actually, I have a question I want to ask you. Earlier in our conversation, we mentioned the difference between big data and I suppose small data. And for this to work, it's going to need a massive amount of data points. How do we collect that data at scale to make technology like the technology you're working on effective? Because
a conversation we have in food and beverage all the time is that we're perhaps not the best at sharing data.
Yeah, I understand your question. Again, we're not the first field to have this problem. So, for example, healthcare has a very privacy conserving issue there. And one of the things that we see popping up is either sharing the data at something called a data lake. So you combine all the data, and authorized actors have the option to research that data. Or what we also work on is something called federated learning. And this is a system that doesn't bring the data into one place, but moves the algorithm around. So your data is securely behind your own firewall, and your algorithm just helps through these different computers to optimize without getting the data out of your system. So that's a way of data sharing without actually sharing your data.
And do you think this technology in the future will also lean on consumer data? Do you think that we will potentially use social media as a data point collection, or even consumers inputting data themselves about the food that they've eaten?
Mm-hmm. Yes, this is something that we have done in the past quite a bit. It's becoming more difficult now since a lot of social medias are closing again. You used to see that everything was open, especially something like X, formerly known as Twitter, used to be very open, and now it's becoming more and more closed off as an ecosystem, which makes it more difficult to really analyze this data. But this is something that we have shown in the past to be able to identify emerging risks based on this kind of data. So I would really advocate for having that kind of data open and able to be analyzed.
We've spoken a lot about food safety in this conversation so far, Bush, but do you think this technology could also be utilised to help prevent food fraud, for example?
Yeah, definitely. We have some examples where we did that in the past. We're currently not researching it that much in our data science team, but we have an entire authenticity team that is investigating food fraud based on these kind of techniques. And I think that's very important, especially with the global system that we have now for getting our food. You can also buy it online. You don't have to go to the supermarket anymore. So this also gives more risk of bad actors to indulge in food fraud. And I think this is very important line to keep in touch. Yes, definitely.
And how would we apply this technology to help prevent food fraud? I am not a scientist by any means, but as I always say, I'm a history graduate. So explain this to me as if you were explaining to a very small child. How would we utilise this technology to, as you say, prevent bad actors from adulterating the marketplace?
Yeah, so there are multiple ways of doing this. Two examples that I think of now. One is you can look at whether the ingredients match what you measure in the sample. So that if that does match up, then that can be a sign that there has been fraud applied to it. But you could also trace the food through its entire chain. Let's say that you have fair trade cacao beans from Brazil. I'm just brainstorming here. Then you could trace that through the entire chain, and if that label has been put on there without it being true, then you can flag this anomaly similar to how you flagged the anomaly in your banking credit card system.
Bash, last question for you. I always like to ask our guests a sort of a crystal ball prediction question in our conversation, which again is extremely unfair because you're a scientist and you rely on firm data points and not on predictions. But if you can indulge me for just a moment, if I was to speak to you in 5 years' time, how quickly do you think the kind of tech that you're working on will have progressed? Will this be a completely different conversation, and will AI be an integral part of our food safety protection measures?
Yes.
Yes, one answer. That is the most definitive prediction I've ever heard. I suppose my next question will be why? Why do you think it's going to be so integral, and how are we going to get to that point?
Yes, I was expecting this follow-up.
I can't let you get away with just one word.
No. You shouldn't. The reason why I said yes so firmly is because we work at a institute that has statutory tasks for the Dutch government to really analyze these samples, and I'm making it part of my job to do things that can end up in the end in these tasks for government to analyze samples. So I'm a believer that should work, and therefore I'm pushing for it. And your timeline on 5 years, I'm not sure if that's actually going to happen, but I do think that this is something that we would have to adapt for because, as I said, data is becoming more complex. The market is becoming more and more complex. There's more globalization, so you also need to protect yourself in more and more complex ways.
Well, Grace, I'll once again hand over to you because I did that interview. Full of cold, I think you can hear. Wasn't a great week for me. What did you pick out? What jumped out at you?
Well, I think firstly, big data blew my mind. I'm a very wordsy, hands-off kind of person, but thinking about how useful it is to bring all these data points together and using them to work out patterns, like utilize it for machine learning, things like that. It's just something that seems so advanced. Like, I think you mentioned science fiction halfway through the interview, and that's exactly what it sounds like to the outside ear.
But what I found interesting, so yeah, I did mention science fiction and Bash straight away. So it's interesting you say that. I get that a lot, but actually, he then rattled off a lot of different sectors that are using it at the moment. And I mean, finance is the first one.
His banking example really struck a chord with me because I was like, do you know what? Yeah, that is so true.
We've all had your bank saying, "Is this you?" And obviously, that's not the case for every single transaction, but they collect big data from both your spending and people like you spending. And then when something doesn't quite fit, they use machine learning and it'll highlight a case and say, this doesn't fit, press the alarm. And then you get asked if your Domino's order was actually you and you have to sheepishly say, yes, it was.
But this has been going on for a while, right? So I think your question about why is the food sector behind, I know we asked Jorge this a few weeks ago, but it is weird that the food sector is slightly more reluctant to be jumping on using.
Yeah, I think we spoke about this last time out, didn't we? I think it is a perhaps a bit more conservative sector when it comes to making decisions, and I do wonder if that's because the price of getting it wrong with food is the penalty is higher perhaps than it is with other industries. But yeah, it is a little bit reluctant, but that does seem to be changing. I mean, Bas mentioned some really interesting projects that he is here working on at Wageningen, and it does sound like there's some real tangible, impactful ways that AI could be used moving forwards.
I want to bring up the human point that you asked Vash about, and I think his answer was slightly different to Jorge's, which was quite interesting. While both of them think that humans will be needed in the process at some point, I think Vash seemed a little bit less adamant that they would be needed in such a way that they are in today's food landscape.
Yeah, and part of me wonders whether that's a scientist, well, an academic scientist answering versus a corporation answering. I think that probably, I wonder whether a human will always need to be involved from a responsibility point of view, in that if something goes wrong and there's nobody sat down with a pulse looking at the data or making the final decision, the ramifications of that are massive. If Wendy's, for example, have to make a huge recall as a result of a decision that a machine's made, and they can't answer and say, no, this person made this call and they made it for these reasons. Can you imagine publicly what that looks like?
I know.
So I wonder whether,
catastrophic for a business,
in a pure kind of ideal setting, maybe humans wouldn't need to be involved, but they probably will always need to be from a PR point of view. It comes down to our own, I suppose, perception of AI and whether we trust it or not. I think that's kind of at the root of this conversation, is do we trust it enough?
But it's one of those ones where companies that are going to put more trust in it, some people might kind of jump on the bandwagon when they see how useful it can be, cutting jobs and saving money in some senses. But it's really interesting when he was pointing out about different recalls and how AI can be utilised to flag them before they're happening. And then that's when the human, at this stage of the game, the human jumps in and then validates what AI has predicted and whether it actually is a recall-worthy notification.
I think it has giant potential, and I actually wonder whether the skepticism around it is similar to the skepticism around PCs or the internet when they were first routinely being adopted by every single industry. And now, can you imagine working somewhere where there weren't PCs? You can't. Every single role in the world.
Do you know what it also
will use
reminds
a
me
PC.
of? When those first local supermarkets came out and there were no cashiers, and you just walk in with your card, and then you aren't paying anybody, you just walk out and it
You
takes
just
you from
walk
it.
out.
Yeah, it's that new concept that's daunting to people. But I can understand, as you said, the price of food going wrong is huge, and it can impact people's lives.
The penalty is large. And in your example, the price of that going wrong is someone gets away with something they haven't paid for, but the price of a food safety recall is, as we've spoke about recently, mammoth. Anything else jump out at you?
I think just the last thing from me, that when you asked the classic 5 years time prediction, I don't think Ross was as keen to say how much will change in 5 years time, because AI is constantly evolving, right? That's what we're hearing all the time at conferences and interviews that we're doing. So it's very hard to put a finger on what's going to be changing at a specific rate. But he was pretty adamant that AI is going to be involved in food safety predictions in the future in a heavy way. So that's really interesting.
I actually find this whole topic so fascinating, and I find the idea of being able to predict outcomes before they arise really, really interesting. And it just seems so otherworldly and so science fiction-y. But then when you speak to people like Bash, who again is so good at explaining very, very difficult concepts fairly simply, which is certainly what I need on the other end of the phone call. And I was thinking about, for example, Google Maps, or any mapping outlet for that matter, but let's take Google Maps, which is another exercise in big data collection. When you put in point A to point B, and it tells you how long it's going to take at this time of the day.
Yeah, counters in traffic,
But it knows that from people that have made that journey at 9 a.m. on a Thursday morning 5,000 times over the last how many months, and it can predict fairly well. That's machine learning. We don't think twice about that. We don't think that doesn't blow my head off the same way that predicting a food safety outbreak in a batch of cantaloupes does, because these conditions have arisen over these last few weeks, and last time we saw those conditions, the X happened. I suppose when it's broken down like that, it isn't as crazy as it first sounds. But I can't wait to see how this progresses. And I think if we sat down here in a year's time, or perhaps even 5 years, 10 years...
I was going to say 20 years' time, I'd love to see where the food industry is at with AI.
I think it'll be like a computer. I think it'll be so part of what we use.
It will be so interesting to see whether food safety will there be a period at the beginning where there's more, when people are getting used to using AI as kind of being dependent on it, or will it immediately have a positive impact on the sector?
Yeah, I think the collection of big data. I also want to pick up on the collection of consumer data being tricky.
With social media as well, I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, I do. And it sounds like that is possible, but not at the moment. But yeah, I found that conversation so interesting. And speaking of interesting, we've got so much fantastic content to bring you over the next few weeks. What have we got next week? We've got a couple of podcasts on GMO legislation in the EU, which is really kicking off as a debate.
I know, you opened my eyes to this a few months ago.
Really interesting and really important too. We've got an interview with Emily Miles from the FSA, where we're going to put your questions to Emily. So
if you've listened to this far, we really want to hear your questions.
Absolutely.
So do send them in to
There's still time, so do send them in. You can get both our email addresses on the New Food Magazine website, newfoodmagazine.com, or also we've posted a couple of posts on LinkedIn. Just comment your question and we'll put it to Emily when we interview her very, very soon. We've got a conversation with Nick Allen from the BMPA, the British Meat Processors Association, which is going to be really, really interesting. Again, awful lot going on with meat import and export at the moment, especially between the UK and Europe.
Yeah.
There's loads. We've also got ethical sourcing coming.
We have got so much for you guys to be listening to, so make sure you've got your post notifications on, because you don't want to be missing Food to Go in the next few weeks.
You certainly don't. And that segues me in very nice to the platforms. You can get Food to Go on Spotify, on Apple Music, on Amazon Podcasts, on Google Podcasts. You can also access all of our episodes on the website, newfoodmagazine.com. Just hit the podcast tab and you'll see every single episode we've ever done over, 3 years, I think it goes back to. What a treat. And last but certainly not least, of course, thank you to Merck Life Science, our sponsors, without whose support we would not be able to produce such compelling content every couple of weeks. So if you need assistance when it comes to cultured meat or renewable agriculture or food safety or anything food and bev related, make sure you go and check out that Merck Life Science website. Grace, I think that's it this week.
Yeah, that's it from us. Thank you so much for listening, everyone, and tune in next time.
Bye-bye.